Okay, good morning, everybody. We will start now. Welcome to this panel at the 15th OECD Forum on Responsible Mineral Supply Chains, entitled Malmö, a Roadmap Toward Ethical and Climate Smart Procurement of EV Batteries. I would like to thank our hosts, the OECD, for supporting the organization of this partner session today. My name is Petra Volterova, and I'm a sustainability advisor with the International Trade Center here in Geneva. I'm currently sitting. And I will be moderating today's session. Just briefly, ITC is a joint UN and WTO agency with the unique mandate of supporting small businesses in developing countries to become internationally competitive and indeed also climate competitive. So the topic today is close to what we work on, also as we support policymakers to move the needle when it comes to trade and environmental sustainability. Now, a possible subtitle of the session might well be how a small city in Sweden is big on sustainability and wants to make its mark in making the mining supply chains more ethical and sustainable. Why here? Why now? Because it is becoming clear that we cannot speak about mineral supply chains and the e-vehicles becoming the mainstream without also speaking about the switch to smart, sustainable mobility in cities and what we call the just climate transition led by cities. A New York Times article in February 2022 asserted that EV battery materials such as lithium, nickel, cobalt could become more sought after than oil. And mining of these materials is, however, often linked to negative impacts on both the environment and communities. So any risk or issue analysis connected to production of e-vehicles and their batteries will also point to high carbon emissions in battery cell manufacturing, very limited transparency in battery supply chains, high geographical concentration in terms of the raw material extraction and battery manufacturing as well, or some of the environmental issues linked to recycling of battery materials, while recycling is also often viewed as the solution to some of the root problems. Therefore, when cities are switching to e-vehicles in their fleets, they are inevitably faced with a host of other questions that go beyond the opportunities inherent in this momentum, those that would be possibly also locking them in other sustainability challenges. And cities are large public procurers, clients of the automotive industry, who can have some leverage potentially over the conditions in the relevant value chains if done right. So the question of how public procurers would respond to this is potentially an incredibly important one. And it becomes even more important as in the course of the past few years, there has been really a great deal of activity by governments, increasingly introducing legislation related to sustainability in value chains, pushing the market beyond the voluntary approaches. The project that we will be talking about today is funded by the European Commission, DG Trade, who also supported the project that brought us at ITC and the city of Malmö together when Malmö won the 2021 title of the EU Cities for Fair and Ethical Trade Award. We know that the EU approaches sustainability in a particularly, let's say, comprehensive manner. The agenda is driven by a strong demand from the European citizens to take part in the respect for human rights and the preservation of the environment through the goods and services that they purchase. As such, the EU has been at the forefront of these new legislative proposals, where one of the most recent ones, and I think notable ones, is the February 2022 proposal for a directive on corporate sustainability due diligence. And this proposal sets out a harmonized and coherent and proportionate EU approach in relation to companies' value chains and their obligations therein. So this is a horizontal instrument, rather, which complements the sustainability reporting obligation of EU companies, but then also other sectoral instruments such as the conflict mineral regulation adopted in 2017, or the proposal for regulation on batteries, which has been actually referenced in the roadmap quite a bit as well, as we will see, or the future proposal on forced labor, which should be adopted by the Commission in September this year. And this legal framework is also what public procurers will be operating in. So the roadmap around which we have built this session is a very concrete initiative in a relatively unexplored field by public procurers so far, in terms of adjusting procurement practices in future tenders for e-vehicles. We believe and indeed hope that if applicable and replicated by other public procurers, cities, such approach can hopefully trigger an even greater thinking about sustainability in this space. And I'm joined here today by a terrific panel to talk about this, where we've got Mr. Olof Kjellgan from the Environmental Department and Fair Trade Office of the City of Malmö, who will present the roadmap at the outset. We also have Mrs. Lena Diesing, who is a policy analyst working on public procurement at the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct. Then we have Dr. Ashton Carter, who is the CEO of TDI Sustainability, which greatly supported the work on this roadmap, I must say. And also he's the executive director of Fair Cobalt Alliance. And also we have Dr. Peter Pawlicki, who is the director of outreach and education at Electronics Watch. Before I give the floor to this esteemed group of colleagues, just a few housekeeping notes for the participants. Please write down your questions to our panelists as they speak in the Q&A function of this webinar. And then possibly any other comments, for everyone to see in the active chat function. We will have time to answer the questions a little later on after the first round of interventions by the panelists. Also, please note that the session is recorded. And finally, please get ready for a very quick Zoom poll, just again after the first round of interventions. And without any further ado, I'd like to now start with you, Olof, to please introduce the main components of the roadmap and its context. And maybe starting with the million-dollar question, are you the first ones to have such a roadmap overall? So the floor is yours, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Very nice to be here at the OECD Forum. I will present a little bit about what we have done during this process of developing the roadmap. And I'm very much looking forward to everyone here, your views on it. Where do you think it will be usable for you and other public procurers? In a way, we hope we are first with this, but in other ways, we hope we're not. So, yes, I will share my presentation here. Okay, you can see it. Yes. Oh, let's not start with the concluding points. Okay, here we go. So yes, my name is Olof Kjellgan and I work at the Fair Trade City office here in the city of Malmö in Sweden. And it's great to be here at the OECD because the OECD has the tagline to develop better policies for better lives. And actually, it's then quite funny that our project is named Better Batteries, Malmö's roadmap for more ethical and climate smart e-vehicle batteries. So we are on the same track, I think.
Olaf, if I can just jump here, we still see your concluding points, actually.
Oh, okay. That's bad. I have switched. Let me try again. So, what do you see now?
Yeah, I think that's the correct slide. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, unfortunately, the electricity is cut here today, so I am using my phone for internet connectivity. So bear with me and tell me if it lags. Okay, but right now I am on the why did Malmö pursue this topic? Yes. Yes.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So e-vehicle sales are growing rapidly. And Malmö aims to be a net zero carbon emission organization by 2030, meaning that we must know how much carbon emissions is released by everything we purchase, basically, and not only at the usage level, but on a life cycle basis. We are also a fair trade city, which means that we have a mandate and we have taken it upon ourselves to work with ethical procurement in the forefront. And we also see a need that many municipalities or buyers are approaching the sustainable mobility in a more silo-based manner, perhaps. And we wanted to avoid that by looking at sustainable mobility in a broader sense, because just buying electric vehicles is not enough to cover the goals that we have, being a fair trade city and also aiming to be a net zero organization. Okay, so I'm switching slides. Should be a car and a bike now. Yes, so about smart mobility, we're looking at both e-bikes and e-vehicles here. And that's because some car journeys can be replaced by an e-bike, and an e-bike battery is maybe 100th of the size of a car battery. And considering the risks that are current in the battery field, that could be quite useful to be also able to move to a more active transport for the staff at Malmö Stad here in Malmö. Okay, and this also ties into the Sustainable Development Goals. They are supposed to be a holistic approach where everything is tied together: climate, ethics, and health. Also, we can see that in Sweden, public procurement economy is quite large, actually 20% of the total GDP of Sweden, of which then municipalities like Malmö cover 13%. And of course, that comes with great responsibility. We have laws and regulations. There are the 5 principles for us as a public procurer. I will not go into the detail right now, but basically we need to be very transparent and equitable towards suppliers as well, to have equal and fair treatment. Then we have policy documents as well. Organization goal comes from the environmental program and also our status as a fair trade city. These are both political decisions and something that me as a civil servant has to work with. We also have a procurement policy that also aims to be integrated and holistic, never looking at just the lowest price, but as a holistic view of the best products for the whole supply chain. And taxpayer money, of course, comes with great responsibility, needs to fulfill many criteria. So, like you said, Petra, we're a small city with maybe big ambitions in a big world. But as I said, we can also take leadership, which is what we're trying to do with this. Since public procurement in Sweden makes up 20%, it's a quite substantial share of our GDP. And we are also a long-term player. We will continue existing for quite a while, I hope, as a municipality. And we have national and international relations, which we are working on right now with you here at this forum. Okay, I'm now at the project phases. So the project has had several phases here. Risk report identified 4 key risks around procuring batteries for e-vehicles, and they are centered around climate emissions and human rights. Then we have the roadmap to address that. The 4 strategic areas I will present a little bit later. There is also structural recommendations specific to Malmö. What can we do about our organization? Does it really work well enough to tackle this huge issue? Now we're here at the communication phase where we communicate about this. And parallel with this, we are working to integrate this into our procurement. The roadmap is really a large smorgasbord of options for us, but also for anyone who purchases e-vehicles to choose from. What can you do to make it more sustainable? Okay, and I'm at key risks now. Yes. So 4 key risks, like I said. Carbon emissions are high in many of the steps of the supply chain of batteries, which of course really defeats much of the purpose of purchasing e-vehicles for climate reasons. Then child labor is also prominent. This is not new, but was confirmed yet again. Transparency is also very low. It's very difficult for us to get information from our suppliers, and sometimes they don't know because the supply chains are so complex and long. Then we have also at the final stage, recycling is incredibly low, around 5% for cobalt and even less for lithium. And this is also something we need to look at. And here one key takeaway from the corporate human rights benchmark is that in their ranking, the automotive sector as a whole got the lowest score of any benchmark sector. And this is, of course, a warning sign to us, or a sign that we are on the right track in working with this. So yes, roadmap, what can we do about these problems? 4 strategic areas, and then they are divided into what is called risk management measures, structural recommendations. So the first one is maybe the most classic one, incorporating considerations into procurement, putting criteria on our suppliers, demanding them to supply us with information. That's not new, but something that can also be done in a much smarter way. And we need to work with suppliers because it can be incredibly time consuming for them, just as it is for us. Then we have reduced unnecessary procurement. Sometimes the best e-vehicle is the one that we don't even purchase because we have these risks to tackle, and taxpayer money needs to go to many things. Then we have address the root causes of ESG issues. We don't want to only sit at the end of the supply chain. We want to speak to alliances and organizations that are closer to the mining industry and closer in the supply chain in general to try and have an impact at the root causes, which can be poverty, of course, and weak enforcement of environmental laws. And last but least, again, we have focus on recycling and reuse. So this is the smorgasbord here. This is what we can choose from, and these are strategic areas, and then they are broken down into much more concrete actions. So how do we prioritize between all of this? Speaking then about our long-term goal, we need standards, we need more certification to be able to do this in an effective way together with the suppliers, because it's very time consuming right now and very hard to get reliable information. So we're aiming to start with the low-hanging fruit. Some examples are just asking for GHG emissions at the life cycle stage, rather than just asking for emission at the usage phase. And then we need collaboration. We are focusing much now on follow-up, because we already do have some demands in place, and no criteria and demands in place are meaningful without us knowing that they are fulfilled. And here we are starting collaborations between the Fairtrade City office here. We are talking to Electronics Watch, who will be speaking later on. We are speaking to ADA, who is our national agency that can help do national follow-ups, and also Ethical Trading Initiative Sweden, which has already helped us start a follow-up on Chinese battery factories. And one point about that is that it can make a huge difference, a factor of 5 between the worst and best case scenario. In Sweden, we have the luxury of having a very low usage of fossil fuels, which makes production of batteries only 20% of the emissions of the worst case scenario in a more coal-reliant economy. And here also we see a huge potential for circularity in Sweden, because we have major battery plants coming up, namely Northvolt. So we're asking ourselves, is there an ethical vehicle battery? No, not that we know. Certainly there is no third-party ethically certified battery for e-vehicles. And maybe we are here at this journey. We became a Fairtrade City in 2006, and then we had 0.45% ethically certified coffee. It took us 12 years to reach 99%. So this is a very nascent field. Relating to that, International Trade Center, who Petra is from, has a fantastic website, standardsmap.org, that everyone can use to identify standard certifications for mainly agricultural products. But the long-term goal is that in the future, you can be able to search for a battery and not have no results found in this database, but rather to have a list of standards certifications that could allow us to find ethical and climate smart batteries. So the sales of electric vehicles and electric bikes are increasing very rapidly. We know that human rights are at least very unknown in the automotive sector. The very low score from corporate human rights benchmark might not be an indicator that things are necessarily bad, but at least we know way too little. It makes a 5 times difference between GHG emissions from best to worst case. So it makes a huge difference what battery we purchase. Despite all of this, many buyers still have very mild criteria, and follow-up is very scarce because it is very resource intensive. So we need to collaborate. And sometimes the best electric vehicle or bike is the one we don't even buy, because we need smart mobility, not just bikes and vehicles in itself. We need third-party certification to work with this in a sustainable way. And every buyer can do something. The roadmap is a smorgasbord of measures to take for anyone who is a buyer of e-vehicles and e-bikes. And I hope to continue this discussion with you now. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ola, for this very good presentation. Thank you also for being a cheerleader for the standards map of ITC. I would like to maybe now turn to Lena to immediately kind of, put this into a bigger picture. This initiative of the city of Malmö, but also vis-a-vis the other public procurers, because we just heard from Olof that buyers have rather mild criteria, or even there are not criteria at all when it comes to procurement of e-vehicles as such. Yet the issues to tackle, we call them sometimes risks, challenges, and especially at the mining sector, are possibly quite large. And you have been working a lot on integrating responsible business conduct in public procurement, with I think a notable pilot really in the garment and textile sector. So what would learnings from the OECD work on this and on responsible business conduct tell us on how public procurers can draw on due diligence when they design their procurement strategies? The floor is yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Peter. Very happy to share some insights there. And ultimately, I think you can summarize it a little bit with what Olaf already said, which is that this whole topic is very nascent. And so on the one hand, we do have some knowledge, some guidance that is actually coming from the private sector. But really what this shows us is that public buyers need to adapt that to their realities, and that maybe we also need some guidance specifically for them. So let's take a step back. If we're talking about due diligence, we have some OECD standards, the OECD due diligence guidance, but also the sector-specific guidances. And that really is a comprehensive consensus on what the elements are. It's a process by which companies or enterprises can identify, prevent, and mitigate actual or potential adverse impacts or risks in their own operations, throughout their supply chains, and in their business relationship. So really complicated outset here. But what I want to emphasize here is that it's really about companies that we're speaking here. And I already mentioned that how that might need some translating then to bring that into the public realm. And that is in a context where public buyers face more and more pressures to incorporate responsible business conduct into their decision making from the citizens, for example, and also to have policy coherence across government. That is why this is becoming more and more important. And that was the focus to help with that for the last 3 years in work that we've done here at the OECD. And now, yes, you mentioned it already, that we had a pilot last year focusing on due diligence in the public procurement of garment and textiles. That's a sector where we do actually have a lot of examples. So this is why this came up, both in the private sector, but also on the public side. And obviously, today we're not talking about textiles, but I think it can still be interesting to look at that, because it shows a little bit of the mechanisms that have worked in one sector that could be transferred to other sectors, including the purchase of vehicles and electronics. So the approach that we took was actually that we gathered different public buyers that shared their experiences. So we really tried to do this bottom up to see what has worked in a public procurement context. We had 26 institutions there, 12 countries around the globe, and participants from all levels of government. So really trying to paint a comprehensive picture. And I think that's also why these insights are really diverse and able to be transferred to other contexts. The first piece of insight there is that we do have a lot of examples of due diligence, and Olaf presented in a way a few approaches as well that other public buyers can draw on. The thing though is that comprehensive approaches are much rarer. So we see that sometimes public buyers are successful in incorporating due diligence in one phase of the public procurement cycle, maybe for one aspect of responsible business conduct, for one issue. And that's fine, right? Because we need to start somewhere. We can't achieve everything at once, but I think the goal maybe is also to see what would a comprehensive approach look like. A key thing here is that public buyers face really strict legal requirements that influence the way they do public procurement, which is probably a key difference to how due diligence would work in the private sector. And that is, just to emphasize again, public procurement is different from procurement in the private sector. So we can't just take the existing approaches and even the existing guidance by the OECD and just transfer that immediately into the public sphere. So yeah, legal frameworks, I already mentioned that. I also want to mention that the steps in taking the decision what to buy are different and are very complex. So we have what we call the public procurement cycle with a distinct planning phase, the tender phase with the competition between different buyers, and then the follow-up phase or the contract management phase. Olaf spoke about that, how they've used that to follow up on some of the criteria. Now, from this pilot, we were able to map all the different actions that public buyers were taking in the garment and textiles procurement and come up with a few general points, I would say. And essentially, it's following this idea of different levels of due diligence. The due diligence guidance has 6 steps, and that in a way can also apply to public procurement. But I really want to say that for a public buyer, due diligence has 3 different levels. On the level of the contracting authority, so that is what we see with Olaf's example, actually, that outside of the concrete purchase, Olaf and his colleagues thought about where are the risks and what does that mean for our purchasing, and also thinking about the strategic goal of making a specific purchase more sustainable. Then, of course, the specific purchase, you could imagine that you have a small due diligence process as part of the planning phase for a specific purchase. We've seen that as well. So choosing different alternatives as part of a specific purchase. And then obviously in the operations of the supplier and the supply chain. So that is something that a lot of public buyers are thinking about at the moment. How can we pass on the obligation to conduct due diligence in public procurement contracts? Finally, if I have that moment, I want to emphasize something that Olaf mentioned as well, which is that collaboration can help a lot in addressing this topic. So this might not be specific, an element of what public buyers can do to incorporate due diligence, but it has helped to achieve a better outcome to, for example, collaborate with initiatives like you mentioned, Olaf, that can help in the follow-up, for example, that can maybe also help in identifying what are the criteria that bring you closer to your goal, and also reaching out to the market to be really tuned into what is possible. This is something where we see, on the one hand, maybe some gaps, but at the same time, also a lot of opportunities. There are initiatives going on in our community to make purchases more sustainable, and collaboration can really help in tapping into that and using the insights. So basically the message being you're not alone in those, with those goals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lena. I must say I really like the emphasis on private and public procurement being really different. The ups and downs, I think, of that as well. Sometimes public procurers also have a little bit more time, maybe the luxury of time, to actually think about this in a more holistic manner, which is also what Malmö has been doing. So thank you very much for these insights. I would like to maybe now zoom in a little bit on that mining and really the root causes, and on Ashton Carter here, because we've heard from Olaf's presentation that really root causes is something that they've been thinking about a lot, and they would like to really actively participate there, to try to address those issues if at all possible. So based on your experience, really, what do you think are the most pressing issues when it comes to these sustainable mining challenges, if we can call them that way, risks perhaps? And what would be some of the most notable initiatives that we can actually, explore, or Malmö can explore later on? And possibly finally, as a third part of this rather longer question, could we pick up a little bit on one of Olaf's conclusions as well in terms of decertification schemes for the whole battery value chain of the battery itself not really being existent? Can you comment on that a little bit? What's the latest development there? Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Petra, and thanks also for the opportunity to join this panel. We really enjoyed working with Malmö City and the ITC on developing the roadmap. And always very conscious that working on a project like this, developing a strategy for a public organization like Malmö City is very rewarding, because it has the potential to make lasting change, just as we've heard from the other panelists. But we're also very sensitive to and grateful to people like Malmö City and Olaf, who are having to actually implement the recommendations that we make. And knowing that they're very much under the scrutiny of their citizens to whom they are accountable. So we can always offer our support, but at the end of the day, Olaf and his team are accountable for the change they put in place. So my first comment today really is to recognize the boldness of an appreciation to Malmö on the responsibility to roll out this roadmap and for ITC to enabling its creation. So perhaps you set me quite a challenge in the 6.5 minutes I have left. I have 16 points, of which I'll focus on 3 for you, and try and cover some of these things, but maybe we'll come back to some of them a little bit later. So I guess my kind of first point here is it's more about the the sourcing of minerals and relationships with mining, recognizing the difficulty of understanding the sources of minerals, which could be thousands of miles and tens of tiers away from the procurement decision. And it's a fair question to ask what are the issues associated with mining, because if you Google mining and batteries and sustainability, you're quickly presented with a lot of issues to be concerned about. However, it disguises much of the complexity in mineral supply chain. So even at its simplest, a battery cathode contains cobalt, nickel, lithium, and manganese, as well as copper, aluminium, and other metals as well. And each of these metals or compounds come from different minerals, which in turn come from many parts of the world, from a variety of different environmental and social settings, and from different geological deposits as well. And it's the geological deposits which determine the extracting and processing techniques, whether that's open underground or open cast mining, the uses of chemicals or not, the sources of renewable versus fossil fuel power, and so on, and the potential adverse impacts associated with them. So it's not really as straightforward as just saying what are the problems to do with mining. It's like what are the problems to do with this multifaceted and complex kind of Rubik's Cube of factors that you have to consider. And so for the downstream, and when talking about sourcing from mining, I'd say one of the biggest issues we face, if I'm sitting in Malmo City, is the ability to get hold of accurate, contextualized information. And Olaf has called this, transparency. So yes, there's transparency about the information, but there's also the information itself, and actually understanding whether that is priority and how to contextualize that. So that's why we, with the Responsible Minerals Initiative, for example, have launched something called the Material Insights platform, which is there really to enable a better understanding of demystification. And why that's important, because Olaf as well talked about, which he has to, the making sure that they spend money appropriately, because it's not theirs, it belongs to the citizens of Malmo, and being able to prioritize appropriately to address these issues is key, and that relies on information. So that was the kind of the first point. The second point, turning more now towards the sustainability issues themselves, the ESG issues, and I've left out a number here on my list of 16 that we can come back to. But one that Olaf mentioned, others mentioned well, is climate change, of course. Now, the whole goal of this is to take climate action and reduce our use on our reliance on fossil fuels, and reduce the GHGs being emitted. Mining, of course, is a very significant emitter of GHGs, anywhere between 4 and 7% of global GHGs. So that's roughly twice the amount as Germany emits annually. And we're going to continue to rely on minerals for our sustainable transition, for our just transition, as Petra called it, towards a greener economy. And the next step in the supply chain, the actually smelting, refining in metals, that's all even more strongly associated. Yes, in Sweden, with your kind of high proportion of renewables, of course, it's much less, but that's the reality. So I guess in pursuit of our goal to decarbonize the economy, we got to be conscious of the GHGs that are emitted from making, extracting, producing minerals as well. And noting that the mining industry is actually taking steps of this, as several of the large mining companies have already set goals for their scopes 1 and 2 to become carbon, zero carbon, net zero carbon. another conversation we can have that's never going to be achieved. Well, one, it's not going to be achieved overnight. And second, that's never going to be achieved without some sort of carbon offset. And so that then triggers a question about, are there sufficient quality carbon offsets available to achieve that goal? So that's something just to be aware of. Third, I put down social license to operate, community company conflict and mining industries. And underneath that, you can put indigenous people's rights, free, prior, and informed consent, which is becoming an emerging issue, not just in what people might call developing parts of the world, but also in Australia and the US, Canada as well, where this has become an extremely important issue. And the point here is that as we demand more minerals for our green transition, the existing mine sites will expand, new mine sites will open, and as that happens, it's not unlikely they're going to bump into communities which are already there, or that they will attract people looking for a better life who will also form communities. And so the potential for conflict is higher, and the skills needed to manage that is extremely high and difficult to attain. And it is not just a matter of community relations, but it's also a matter of understanding what is the role of mining in sustainable development of their host communities. Which takes me on to the kind of second point, and maybe the third point that Petra asked me to address, which is about what are the initiatives we can use to, or public procurers can participate in to address some of these issues. And of course, I think there are two sort of interrelating frames for this. One are the certification schemes or voluntary sustainability schemes, as they're called, VSS. Olaf mentioned that Malmö is a fair trade city, and I can see that it would be wonderful to have a battery standard which does what the fair trade does, and it's a trust stamp, a trust mark, which you can trust the whole way down. We can discuss this a little bit later, but there isn't at the moment the way that in the mineral supply chain, the way that standards have been developed over the last 20 years or so is being at the kind of the horizontal level of the sector. So they'll develop them for mining, or they'll develop them for refining or manufacturing and fabrication. Fewer had gone down the whole supply chain. And so there's a little bit of a pause, but we can come to that in a minute. The piece I wanted to close on, I think, is that when a problem is associated with mining or mineral development, such as Olaf brought up child labor as one of the four key risks, it's very often that issue is associated with a dynamic which is outside the control of the mining company. And in that case of child labor with Cobalt in the DRC, it's associated with poverty, as well as some governance issues as well. It's not that the large-scale mines are employing children at their mines. And so then it comes to the question of what is the responsibility of the supply chain actors, including the city of Malmö, to act on something like that. Standards are a part of that, and so we've been developing a standard specifically on small-scale mining and cobalt for artisanal miners in the DRC. But a standard alone, and the limitation of standards, is that they don't address the root problems. You can't use a compliance instrument to address a development problem. And so what is emerging then is the opportunities of multi-stakeholder initiatives or industry action platforms, as they're kind of commonly called, where you can pool the resources, whether those are financial or technical or political, to a specific issue. And in the case of Cobalt, we developed something called the Fair Cobalt Alliance with our sister organization, the Impact Facility. And the idea there is that you have organizations from all along the supply chain, in our case, from Tesla to Google, to the Glencores, the mining companies, and the Chinese companies as well, who said it's in our common interest to address these root causes that are associated with mining, but for which we aren't directly responsible, nor can we directly through a standard address. And that, I think, makes total sense because by doing that, you are addressing the root causes of the social problems felt by the communities, and at the same time addressing the reputation and compliance risks that will come down to bear on the procurement officers as well. So that's really kind of my contribution for now. I'm sorry for going a little bit over time, and we can come back to the standards and other specific instruments later in the conversation. But thank
Excellent.
you.
I think it was very much on point, and thank you for limiting it to 3 points, as you said, even though I heard more. But thank you very much for expanding, especially on that standard component, because we really had a lot of discussions with the city of Malmö on that as well. So, you know, having worked on these issues in ITC before, and I think in the battery passport technology, somehow this has been discussed a little bit in terms of some sort of a role for setting some minimum acceptable standards for a sustainable, what would really constitute a sustainable battery. But this is also, I think, with a big question mark at this point. So there may be, again, there's definitely a scope for discussion there. But as we spoke about, really maybe relying on pools of knowledge and really, you know, people coming together and procurers coming together, I would like to now turn to Peter from Electronics Watch, who have really worked a lot with public buyers to drive measurable improvements in electronics value chain, specifically really focusing on workers' rights, so from that social perspective. And we now know that there really has been a lot done already on this ICT equipment side and what public procurers can do. But now the EV batteries really seem to be in the next frontier. So could you introduce a little bit the most recent program on this that you've, I believe, just launched maybe a month ago, approximately, and how it really focuses on the role of the public buyer?
Yes, thank you, Petra, and thank you for inviting us to speak here. Yes, the low emission program has been launched on April 1st. So it's just started. To give you an understanding what the low emission program is, I'll briefly dive into what we at Electronics Watch do, because the program is basically an expansion of what we do. So we are a civil society organization that is focused on human and labor rights. We monitor electronic supply chains, though we monitor manufacturing and increasingly also the mining parts of these supply chains. If we find violations of rights or risks of violations, we engage with brands and manufacturers and organizations like, for example, the Responsible Business Alliance. Why do we engage? We want to see remediation. We do all of this for our members. We call them affiliates. Our affiliates are around or a bit above 400 public buyers in Europe and Australia, and they want to meet their organizational responsibility and sometimes also obligation for human rights and environmental due diligence. And public procurement is actually quite a good way to do that, especially if you work and focus on contract management. And Lena brought us already up. It's good to work on a holistic way, but contract management gives you actually in public procurement a good starting point, because you have long contracts. It's 5 to 7 years sometimes. So you really have time to engage with your supply chain as public buyer. You can find out what the violations are, what the risks are. You can find out about compliance issues, and you can even start to do something about it. And the goal of our affiliates is to seek measurable and transparent improvements. Why? Is it about improvements? Because they know that there are risks and violations in every supply chain. And if we look at ICT, ICT has super overlapping supply chains. So basically all the components in every different brand product is the same. So you can't actually say a laptop is more socially sustainable than another laptop. If you look from a scoring perspective in a tender phase of a public buyer. But what you can actually do is you can work towards improvement with your supply chain, improvement on the situation you found. But to be able to engage toward improvement, public buyers, as we already discussed, need the understanding of the current situation. So they need to know what is happening. And public buyers mostly don't have the expertise or the resources to do that. This is why they affiliate with Electronics Watch, because they then can access an extensive network of monitoring partners in the production regions of the electronics industry. Our monitoring partners are local civil society organizations. They are experts in labor rights, in labor advocacy, and in working with vulnerable workers. and communities. On top of that, we give our partners a training, so they also become experts in standardized monitoring methodology, in our monitoring methodology. And then they can go out and gather data, corroborate it, because that's really important, and analyze it, so we really understand what is happening. They do this mostly in offsite interviews with workers. That's a very good, as we found, method to do that. At the end, we have a monitoring report that lets us and our affiliates, and that's a very specific thing. Our affiliates have a full transparent perspective on our monitoring report. They can then understand what is the situation, and we help them to understand, to contextualize the data, obviously. And they understand it not for some region or for some factories or for some brands. No, they understand it for a factory that is directly linked to the products that they have procured or that they are procuring. This report is then the basis for the engagement with the industry. So we approach the brands that are linked to the factory and the manufacturers and also the RBA, and we work with them to drive remediation for the affected workers. So sum up, we don't certify, we monitor and engage on behalf of public buyers. Over the last 7 years, we have shown that this model is actually working. It's very well working with public procurement, and it does have a huge impact. So we are now able to document the measurable impact and improvements for hundreds of thousands of workers across mostly Asia and Europe. I don't want to say globally, because the industry is not global. And this is why we have been thinking over the last years how to expand our impact model to sectors, to more sectors that are relevant and important for public buyers. And vehicles actually seemed like the most interesting for us. Because if you focus on the strategic components of cars, this is the battery and the electronics. You can't talk about batteries if you don't talk about electronics. And then we would be able to basically use our expertise in electronics. Probably everybody has heard about the chip shortage that has kept car factories idle for the last months. And these chips are actually produced in the same factories along the same supply chains as the chips for laptops or servers or smartphones. And our increasing expertise in monitoring raw materials is also important here. We monitor right now tin, nickel, cobalt, and lithium. So that's actually rather handy. And so we have the means to do that. And then we started to talk to our affiliates. Would you be interested in the topic? And the response was rather huge. And there was a huge interest. So this is why we decided to set up the low emission vehicle program. And over the course of the last months, we were actively searching for participants, and we were able to gather a really interesting group of organizations. So as participants, this is APUC, that's the procurement consortia of the Scottish universities. It's the City of Barcelona, the Flemish government, City of Hamburg, City of London, City of Oslo, and the Belgian Federal Institute for Sustainable Development. And we are also in talks with Malmö on how we can sync our works together. If you are a public procurer and you're interested in the program, please do contact me. It is a 3-year program. And now I will tell you a bit at the end what we want to accomplish with. We obviously want to kind of move our experience and expertise and our impact model in the new sector, but it's a different sector. So first, we will develop procurement tools that will actually allow public buyers to include verifiable and executable human rights and labor rights obligations. They will include this into the tenders and contract, and we want to go live with our participants with tenders that will use the tools. So at the end of the 3 years, we will have tools and we will have tried and tested solutions. This is a central part always of our work. Second, we will obviously consult and support our participants to develop the internal capabilities that will allow them for sustainable vehicle procurement. This is really important. Internal capabilities is a huge point in sustainable public procurement. Third, we will obviously be monitoring semiconductor manufacturing, mining, but also battery production in several locations globally. This will allow us and the participants to consolidate the insights on what is actually happening in their supply chains. Fourth, we will establish industry engagement capabilities with the automotive industry. Up until now, we have been always in talks with the big electronics brands. All of the ones that you think of, we talk with them on almost a daily basis. But with the low emission vehicles program, we will have to talk to big car OEMs, completely different sector, completely different companies. But the interesting part is they are increasingly becoming members of the RBA and have been already members of the Responsible Mining Initiative, which is basically an initiative of the RBA. So that's a good start. So we have kind of some overlap here, but we will use the monitoring reports that we will gather to have concrete engagement based on specific data. So it's not about let's talk, it's really about let's talk about issues that we found. And finally, and that's my last point, and that is really a very interesting point about the automotive sector is, and that's the huge difference to electronics, there are actually unions in automotive industry, and they are actually rather very strong. While we have been, since our inception, working with independent unions as the legitimate representatives of workers, in electronics, unions are really not existent or are not really strong. So, the situation is completely different in the automotive industry. So we have a stakeholder very strong. We are already investing in the Metal Workers Union, the IG Metall, to develop a project to really move towards developing works councils and labor unions as an active stakeholder in this impact model. And that's it for the low emission vehicles program at Electronics Watch.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think we've had, I think you encountered some connection difficulties, so we haven't heard completely the last point about the unions and the project to develop them as a stakeholder, but I think it came through. So with this, I think we have a pretty comprehensive picture of the situation and the roadmap and how it all fits also, within the broader public procurement discussion. And I know that we have two questions from the audience so far, so we will keep them for a little bit, because what I would like to do now possibly is to launch actually a Zoom poll for the attendees that we currently have. We have I think we have 45 attendees. I think I can share that. So we should have some interesting data hopefully coming through. We will ask you now a question before we go into more of a moderated discussion later on of whether you have heard of any other city or public buyer or procurer with such a progressive approach in this area in terms of the batteries and minerals. So please, this is more a survey for us because we are really interested in knowing whether anyone has heard about something similar by another buyer. We see at least one yes, which is very interesting actually. 2. Why we are asking is that we will ask you then who these public procurers might be, because the purpose of this session is also for Malmö to get a little bit more feedback and take the roadmap further. And as we've heard, collaboration is an incredibly important and possibly also impactful way of getting this issue a little bit further. So I think we can stop. Still some answers coming through. I think we can stop the poll now. So we have 2 yeses Otherwise, it's overwhelmingly no, which we expected a little bit. But now I would be really interested in hearing from those who submitted yes. If you can please maybe elaborate on that a little bit in the chat function, that'd be really appreciated, so that we also get a little bit of feedback and expand our horizons. Because in the development of the roadmap and generally in our discussions over the past year, it's been really difficult to actually identify these actors. So please, if you can, submit it there. And I will maybe now try to, if we can answer the questions from the audience at this point, actually. We've got two. One is, and I see that there are also some others coming through the chat box, so we will try to somehow moderate that. The first one came from Stefan Olsen, and he asked whether is there awareness of the activities of the Global Battery Alliance in this initiative, because the GBA is the Battery Industry Alliance involving a multitude of stakeholders formed to establish the necessary standards and information sharing procedures, also needed to meet the EU battery regulation. I think we both mentioned that as well in the presentations that just happened. So there, maybe Olaf, would you be able to expand on it a little bit, or I can also say a few words, because both of us actually were in touch with them. And yes, just a very short initial answer, we have been aware of this alliance.
Yeah, I mean, we have, I think you know more about them. You've had more contact than me, I think.
Yes, so just very briefly, we have been in touch with the Global Battery Alliance, but also at the time that we were drafting this roadmap, they have seemed to be in a little bit of a hiatus because there was a governance shift. So we weren't able to connect with them directly, but we know that they would be essentially the ones very important in the battery passport technology that I also mentioned in one of the comments before. So yes, indeed, there is awareness for sure about this alliance. We are yet to explore exactly how they will contribute to this space and where they are at this point of discussion. I think Ashton is nodding. Ashton is also, I think, been following this from the TDI sustainability perspective. So if you have anything else to add there, please do.
No, we're actually members of the GBA as well, and I have been collaborating with them in the past on the Cobalt standard that we've written. So yes, we are very aware. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And then maybe Ashton, I will also stay with you for the next question, and of course anyone else from the panel as well. The due diligence done by upstream companies is expensive, really, those that are at the start of the value chain. So is there any cost sharing mechanism known between upstream and downstream companies or entities?
So I always get a bit confused about how people understand what is upstream and downstream. So do they mean due diligence done on upstream companies, on mining companies by?
Yes, I think so. I think that's,
yeah.
I think how it was meant, yes.
No, it's a very good question, and I mean, even if you go to the OECD due diligence guidance, given that we're in the forum of the OECD, they do talk about. I'm sure Lena can talk to this as well, but they do say that this, when you do enhanced due diligence, that you shouldn't necessarily have to do it all by yourself. In fact, look for groups of industries who you can do it and you can share it with. So certainly the sentiment is there, or there's an allowance for it in the guidelines surrounding it. The answer is, are there some available? Again, to my first point is that, you know, supply chains are generally done at the moment by material rather than by a battery, for example. So in a battery, you might have 3, 4, 5, 6 different supply chains, depending on which materials. In some of those, for sure, yes, there are some sharing mechanisms, but we'd have to get a little bit specific about which ones you're talking about. And some of the newer materials which are only just recently come into the public, on the public radar, if you want, you know, like nickel and lithium, less so, but others like kind of cobalt, gold, there are some, but yes, how to centralize them and orient people to where they are and decide what is appropriate for your company or your procurement officer to be involved with is another kind of matter.
Thank you very much for that, Ashton. This is really useful. Maybe I will also turn to Peter, because you also mentioned, you know, from your perspective, how you actually support, and you really emphasize that the internal capabilities also of these companies. So can you maybe also complement that a little bit, Ashton's answer so far?
Yes, so the idea that electronic swatch is monitoring means basically that public buyers are, or our affiliates, they pay annual affiliate dues to us. So they finance monitoring systems that monitor the industry. So basically, there is a complementary due diligence system financed by public procurement that is helping the industry to be more compliant, but also in the talks that we have had with brands, internal talks, we have had already some feedback that, oh, thank you for these insights. We were not able to gather this kind of very specific, very deep down knowledge on specific factories. So I think there is also a cost sharing here by public buyers actually financing their own monitoring.
Okay, thank you very much for this, Peter, as well. So hopefully we've answered the question somewhat, even if it's not immediately clear, there's not, let's say, a very quick answer to that. Now, there is another question that came through to our panelists from Janina. I don't see the full name, unfortunately, but I will just read it out loud, and then I think I may ask Lena if you can then respond to it. So are there already any concrete recommendations on public procurement criteria for EV vehicle tenders, or the possibility for further cooperation on this topic between public procurers? And the challenge I see is the lack of a standard like a sustainable EV certificate. We've talked about this as well. Hence, we have to find a workaround in the tenders. So Lena, please, the floor is yours if you can comment on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's a very good question, and maybe this is something to keep in mind, let's say, for future reference where we have to go, because obviously that has worked in other areas well. On the one hand, to have a certificate that is easy to incorporate into the tender criteria and so on. I think there are other things, I guess, that have to be done in the meantime while we're working this out. Olaf commented, I said it as well, it's a nascent field. I think it's also due to the complexity of the product that we're talking about here. But even if we don't have this one set of recommended criteria, I think we can start thinking about this and find alternative ways on making the purchase more sustainable, even if we will maybe not achieve 100% at the first try. But I think it's important then to be in a dialogue with the market and find out what is actually possible, and then try to find ways to incorporate that in the specific criteria. So again, market dialogue is really important, and staying abreast on what is possible. Obviously, also a challenge for procurers who lack capacity sometimes to spend a lot of spend a lot of time in these kinds of planning stages, getting to know the market, getting to know the industry. And that's why I agree that it's very important to collaborate and learn from each other and not reinvent the wheel for every specific purchase. So in that sense, very important work that we see in Malmö.
Thank you very much, Lena. Olaf, from the city perspective, then can you add anything to what Lena just said?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the roadmap consists of recommendations, so it will be done in about a month, like in the public version. But some simple things to start with is just asking the supplier for GHG emissions on the LCA level, or whether they have, for example, an environmental product declaration. You can ask them that, and if they can't respond, usually the problem is that we are so far away from the production, and even in Sweden, they have to go to the German office, and even only between there, you know, there is a lack of communication sometimes. So talking to your national procurement agency, I'm not sure what country you're in, Janina, would be happy to know, but in Sweden we have the national, Germany, okay. So in Sweden we have the National Procurement Agency, which are now approaching, trying to sort of cut one step in talking to the Swedish suppliers and talking directly to the sustainability coordinators or managers of the car manufacturers in Germany when we purchase German vehicles, and to really get coordinated first-hand information. And then, we can connect to the national tender to be able to procure from that, and by that way, avoiding having to do all that work again. Then also I would add, Peter here is here from Electronics Watch, and they are launching the low emission vehicle program, right? And that's an opportunity to really collaborate. We are also joining in Malmö. There is something called Ethical Trading Initiative. I know that's exists in many countries, maybe in Germany as well. They have a small working group here in Sweden. You can start small, you can start big, but there are many others working on this. So do join forces, look up what there is. And then I hope, when the roadmap gets out, it will be quite useful for you as well. Some things, like I said, are really simple, short-term, low-hanging fruit, and some things are more long-term. Yeah, I hope that was
Thank you.
Adding to the answer.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Olaf. Maybe also for Peter, if you may have any few points to add to this. Again, a lot of has been already said, I think, and we again converge a little bit more around the roadmap, but again, from your perspective on this particular,
yes,
this is an important one.
It is an important one, and I think that's the biggest question coming always from public buyers is there a standard? Is there a certificate that we can easily just add? And my answer is always, even if there is one, you shouldn't stop with it. You need sustainable procurement is about not only asking the industry to change, but also needs procurement to change. This is very, very, very important. And this is a strategic change that public procurement needs to start as soon as possible. So a label can be a good start, but then with the next procurement, you need to do more. What both Lena and Olaf mentioned, talking with the supply chain is something that is not standard way of doing business for public procurers, but starting this is important. Start asking by questions. You don't have to put them in a tender. You can just have regular meetings with your suppliers. Start giving them the impression, not only it's about the tender phase, but we are really interested about social and environmental issues. We want to know what you do, and we want to see improvements from you. So there are a lot of things that you don't have to put in a tender. You can put basically also in your contract and say, we want to work with you during the contract management phase. Over the next 4 years, we are partners through a contract. Let's sit down, let's work out a good way how to deal with things, how to communicate, how to establish what you can do, what we can do, how we can support you, and how you can support us in achieving specific goals. I think this dialogue orientation is really the central part.
Yeah, it's again seems to be coming across a lot in terms of the importance of collaboration and dialogue and market dialogue. And the moment that you said also that we shouldn't stop there, you meant as public procurers, just taking a certification and going away with it. I think that Ashton would also have a lot to say in terms of the other side of the value chain there. And before you do, maybe Ashton, because there was another question actually from the Q&A, which I think feeds into this a little bit, because Sanjida, she asked, it's more of a comment, that she's a bit curious on the issue of certification. So it really fits here in this part of the discussion. Can we really trust these certifications when we already know the limitations of such processes in other sectors? And she mentions coffee and textile garments. Any reflection? So now I turn over to you, Ashton.
Yes, you're right. And those two kind of points or questions or topics do kind of come together. And trying to think where to start. I think on the one of the things which came up quite soon when we started working with Malmö was a very kind of practical solution, and that's why Olaf suggested having a roadmap. So although I understand that we all want to find this magic certification which is going to assure everything, I think the very kind of practical steps that Malmö has taken is replicable. and because it deals with what's there. And that's a kind of a message about supply chains, having worked in for 25 years with some of the biggest companies with has like 500 different supply chains at least. You have to start, you got to start somewhere and start very practically. And that's because while it might be new to the public procurers, it's also new to many people up the supply chain as well, because mostly people are just getting on with their business, making their product and then putting it down the supply chain. And now we're asking them to develop and to generate data and information and put it into sort of different boxes that they're not familiar with, and they're not quite sure why they're being asked to do it or what happens with that information, even if it is in dialogue. And quite often they don't have time to doing dialogue, and quite often a procurer might pick up the phone to a supplier and the supplier might not answer because they're not the biggest procurer. So I think, so one of my messages here is that, you know, do it progressively. So, and that I think is what we have in the roadmap with Malmö. And then I turn to what the OECD does, and the OECD framework says start with your first tier and then pass on the love, as it were. And it's basically, and so what is it that we can do? So in another project, we kind of focused on kind of 4 things. We focus on the first tier, and we go, well, let's first start with what we control, which is your business conduct at your site. Let's start with that. But then let's also look at something on GHG reductions. Let's do that. Let's also look at recycling. And then fourth, and importantly, let's also start to look at the responsible sourcing to see how much you know about your own supply chain. And that's essentially what the OECD is urging people to do. So I think if you put in that context, you can actually come up with a practical plan, which is defensible and has results. And also it enables you to engage your suppliers, because I can tell you from working on the upstream and the midstream that, you know, there's just too many questionnaires flying around out there, and what they want to know is what you want. And they want to know how you want that information, and they want to know why, and they want to know what you're going to do with it. So clarity about that rather than dialogue, I think, is more important, to be honest. And then coming to the certifications thing, where the question is, can we trust them? And there have been a few recent reports in the last couple of weeks, which is suggesting that we can't always. I think you've got to go into these things eyes wide open. So in all our work on standards, we get very precise about what they do and what they don't do, because they all have limits, they all have limitations, they all have been designed with a particular purpose in mind, and that particular purpose doesn't necessarily apply to the other things that you want it to apply to. And so, can we trust them? I think you can trust them if you get educated about what they are intended to do and what they assure and what they don't assure. If you want them to hold out the promise for everything that is emergent and is on your desk as being an issue, then you're going to be disappointed. So I guess that's my response. Thanks, Petra.
And this is a very important response, and thank you very much for also adding this perspective, you know, really from the private sector. I must say in ITC, we've seen also very similar approaches. You cannot just have questionnaires and dialogues and just take them as a, you know, a box ticking exercise, obviously, because then it leads nowhere. Yeah, I completely agree. So thank you very much for making that point. Maybe after this, I will just check whether we have any other questions. I think that most have been responded so far. I also see that there is some interesting discussion going on in the chat of this webinar, so that's really encouraging. Before we go to maybe just a few concluding questions for our panelists, you've now heard a lot about the roadmap from both Olof, but also the others. Ashton, he also alluded a lot on the approach taken there. So we would like to ask you again through another poll question very quickly. I'm now realizing it might not be formulated very clearly, but do you think that the roadmap can be replicated? Let's leave out the word easily. I don't think that we now know that it can be easy, but from what you've heard so far, just as a piece of feedback again for us, because the replicability is really an important issue in this project, we have been mindful of that a lot. And we see, as opposed to the first question, an overwhelming yes here, which is very nice. I believe maybe a little bit more time just so that we see how much support there is for this motion. There is one no. But yeah, I think that the pattern is there now. Okay, very good. And So maybe building up on that then now, in terms of the replicability, and really the sequencing and prioritization, that has been again a different, let's say, segment of our long discussions with the city of Malmö and TDI, and also actually quite a few other stakeholders as well. But if we really speak about sequencing and those long hanging fruits also that Olaf mentioned, I will have two questions for all our panelists now. What do you think is the most important thing that the public procurer can do to make the battery supply chains more responsible? It's a very high level question, but pick one issue from everything that we've heard: dialogues, more comprehensive approaches, more holistic approaches, questionnaires, yes, no, etc. What's the first thing to do? And then how really the next steps for increasing the sustainability of the battery value chains more as a whole, as a whole scene, really. How does it look like? Let me start with Lena, if I can. Just, some reflections, please.
Yes, of course. I'm very happy to do that. So I think the most important thing is really what we're seeing now, start thinking about it. I think, actually, I'm coming back from another conference where one discussion I had precisely on this topic of e-vehicles was that now everybody jumps on purchasing electronic vehicles thinking that that's the way to reduce CO2 emissions, which of course is an important goal that we have as well. So that just goes to show that we need to think about all of the sustainability implications of these kinds of decisions. And just seeing that there is more awareness about the supply chain implications, the human rights implications, and environmental implications in the supply chain, not just the CO2 emissions of the vehicle itself. I think that's already a big step, and that then allows us to open the door to take concrete steps. And the next steps then, I think, from the perspective of public procurement would just be to start thinking also then concretely about how can I reflect my insights that there are certain issues into a public tender. And as I mentioned before, that's not an easy thing to do, but I think we can take first steps and include maybe at least one thing that already will have a contribution to a more sustainable purchase writ large, thinking about the entire sustainability concept for the public sector. So yeah, thanks.
Excellent. So start thinking now. Ashton, over to you, please.
I've spoken quite a lot, so I think I've answered some of these, but let me just kind of recap. So I think I do think the roadmap is something which is replicable. I saw a comment in the chat box of saying it's not replicable until we see if it works. I would say that the approach and the framework is something which is replicable. The contents of it might alter. But the point is that you've set a course for the future and you put in markers at points at which you can do it. So I think that is the right thing to do. I think then there's to prioritize and act. So that means do the assessment on the potential impacts in the supply chain. And in the absence of a mechanism to exclude them from the supply chain, which can also have negative results, look to mobilize your resources on those priorities to eradicate the root causes, such as we've been saying with Cobalt and Cobalt Alliance. Two other things which I think are kind of really important thinking about the position of public procurers. One is, again, what I've heard is beginning to happen, is to reach out to other cities who are of a similar mindset, because I can imagine that some procurers say, well, although we are supposed to have influence, we're not nearly as big as some of the corporations who are just next door. But together with our other cities, there's a little bit more power and influence in the supply chain. And then I think the fourth is that the leadership. So exactly what we're doing today is the public procurement, which reports to elected officials, is taking a stand and setting a signal for what it thinks is the right direction to be going. And I think that's has legitimacy, and more than the private sector has legitimacy, because you are in fact an elected government and represent citizens. So I think don't underestimate the importance of leadership and taking a public stand on certain things, because I think that is very valuable in setting the tone and the direction.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ashton. I have just been nodding the entire time. You also stole at least 2 of my concluding points, which I don't have to repeat now. So thank you for that. Peter, now also you, any reflections on these 2 really broader questions?
Yes. My point is always start as soon as possible. Go the first step, take risks. First steps always means take risks. You don't have to have such a brilliant roadmap as Malmö has. You can also do the muddle through strategy, but start. That's the important point. Don't wait for standards. Don't wait for certifications. Don't wait for all these external things. Because even if you start using them, you will need to go through a learning process. Your market bidders will need to go through a learning process. The earlier you start to including something into your tenders that relates to sustainability, the earlier you start reflecting on what went wrong and what went right. Actually, the what went wrong is more important, and start learning and building from this, the earlier you will be capable to do these things. The second thing is get your procurement staff trained. You don't do that, this will end in checkbox exercises of I have this certification or I don't have it. But you will fetch
I think, Peter, I don't know if it's only me, but I cannot hear now what you're saying. I think that your network bandwidth seems to be quite low.
Yes.
So maybe...
Sorry, I'm in Germany. I'm in Germany, and not good with internet here.
This is the downside of these webinars, I think, really,
okay.
Of course, over the past years. But maybe if I can ask you, you had, we've heard a little bit on your second point. So maybe if you can just write up a little bit for everyone, your concluding points there, so that we don't miss them all together. Again, we have 3 minutes left. I think, again, most of my scribbles here, most of my concluding points have been actually said as well. So what I'd like to do by way of closing would be to actually give the last word to Malmö. Olaf, if you can maybe expand a little bit and spend these couple of minutes, outlining even a little bit more what the next steps for you really are, maybe in greater detail, and what would you like to see, what's happening after this session?
Okay, thank you. So yeah, it's been very interesting. I've started taking on a little bit more of the supplier's perspective already during this session, because really what standards are about is also not having this annoying questionnaire from 1,000 different public procurements, right? So yes, that really ties into collaboration. We need to start learning about what are their challenges and try to talk them. If maybe your local supplier cannot answer you, maybe try and say, but hey, who do you think can, and then also really talk to on a national level. There is likely to be similar things to the National Procurement Agency in Sweden. I'm sure there are similar things, maybe on regional or national level. They have often much larger tenders. They have more time. They have also put quite substantial time often into these tenders and have much more progressive criteria than many municipalities. And so you can use that also as inspiration and learning. And then last but not least, of course, really sign up for the newsletter that we will be publishing a couple of times a year, and which will contain the final roadmap that we hope can be useful for as many as possible. And we're really happy to keep in contact with you all. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Olaf, and also for giving me a segue only for a final, really concluding sentence, because I think we're right on time, that we will be sending out a follow-up email with this. You also prepared already now kind of a 4-pager with more details from the roadmap. So also things that Olaf didn't describe in greater detail. And then also, as he said, in more or less a month's time, we should also have a more detailed view into the roadmap, again through about 20-25 pages, hopefully. So really providing more detail for all of you to take a look at and understand a little bit better where we are coming from and what is being proposed. So this is all upcoming. So we will share all these details hopefully early next week in a follow-up email to those of you who attended the session. And with this, I really would like to thank all of you, all our panelists, Olaf, Ashton, Lena, Peter, to really be here with us, enlighten us so much on these issues, and I think really providing a really nice holistic perspective, again in the spirit of this roadmap as well, and Malmö's approach to sustainability, which really is holistic. So thank you very much for that. We really appreciate it. As Olaf is saying, any comments, any feedback on the roadmap from the audience, please write them still here in the chat. We'll be definitely happy to hear them. We wanted to hear from you a lot, as much as possible. And yeah, on this note, I will conclude the session. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.